Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this year's Hayek Annual Memorial Lecture, the Memorial Lecture for 2020. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and thanks for joining us for this first ever virtual lecture. We're usually a bricks and mortar event, but this time it's virtual. The Hayek Lecture has been one of the highlights of the IEA's calendar since its inception in 1988, and we were determined not to let the pandemic get in the way of this important occasion for us. Over the years, the lecture has featured renowned economists and authors, including Nobel Prize winners from around the world. But this year, our focus is a little closer to home as we honour one of our very own staff. Dr. Stephen Davies is an author and historian, and he's head of education here at the IEA. But he's also much, much more than that. It is fair to say that Steve is revered by generations of students that he's tutored and influenced. He is admired by people he's worked with right across and around the globe, and recognised as one of the smartest and wisest men you'll ever meet, and one of the planet's very, very best teachers. But don't just take our word for it. Here are just a few people who, when they found out Steve would be delivering this year's Hayek Memorial Lecture, wanted to pay their own personal tribute to him.
I knew Steve when we were students together at St Andrews, and since then I've appreciated how very good he is with students, and he can talk knowledgeably on any subject you care to mention, from quantum physics to Serbo-Croat poetry. People say that Adam Smith was the last person who knew everything, but no, it's Steve Davies.
Steve is incredibly well read. At the Institute for Humane Studies, it was said that Nigel Ashford knows everyone and Steve Davies knows everything.
Congratulations, Steve Davies, on being selected to give the Hayek Lecture this year. I can't wait to hear it. Steve's a teacher's teacher, and he perfectly balances that deep knowledge of a subject with incredible style. And one piece of advice for anyone who's ever on the program with him: make sure you go before Steve, because he's an impossible act to follow.
Steve Davies is one of the most perceptive and thorough and careful and intelligent historians and scholars that there is. And I particularly have hugely valued his penetrating contributions to the history of ideas. For example, the story of how schools came to be the way they are, one of his fascinating pieces of work.
It's a privilege to work with Steve Davies, from whom I learn every time we speak. Steve's a model lecturer, the only person I know who, when asked to speak for 40 minutes, will deliver, without written notes, a complete lecture, and at precisely the 40-minute mark say, well, here we are, and stop. I look forward to this lecture.
Well, there are some endorsements indeed of Steve's great work and sharp mind over the years. But before I tell you a little more about Steve, I'd just like to give a heartfelt thanks to CQS, who for many years have given their support to this Hayek Memorial Lecture and have made it possible to make it happen. Without their generosity, we wouldn't have been able to attract such distinguished speakers from so far afield and put these sort of events on. So we thank them for their magnificent and continuing support, even in these very challenging times. Now, before I invite Steve to the podium, just a little bit more about him. Before joining us here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, he was Programme Officer at the Institute for Humane Studies. You heard from his former colleague there, Nigel Ashford, in that clip. The Institute for Humane Studies based at George Mason University in Virginia. Before that, he was Senior Lecturer in the Department of History and Economic History at Manchester Metropolitan University. And he's also been a visiting scholar at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center at Bowling Green State University, Ohio. He has also authored several books, including The Economics and Politics of Brexit, the Realignment of British Public Life, and The Wealth Explosion, the Nature and Origins of Modernity. And Steve's also presented some of our most watch films right here on our IEA London YouTube channel. You'll be able to find those very easily with a quick search. Before the lecture begins, a few housekeeping notes. We are hosting this lecture on 2 different platforms. If you're joining us on Zoom and you would like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Type your question in there. You don't need to wait until the lecture's over. If there's a question on your mind, then please type it in there. And those of you on Zoom, even if you don't ask questions, can upvote the questions that you want me to put, and I'll be inclined to take those towards the top of the list. So give a thumbs up to the ones that you'd like me to ask. I'll ask all of you on Zoom to remain on mute throughout, so I'm afraid you'll hear the question delivered through my voice rather than in your own voice, but that makes it a lot easier for us to organise. If you're watching on YouTube, please do put questions and thoughts in the YouTube chat. I'll do my best to watch 2 screens in front of me at the moment and fire some of those questions at Steve too. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome to deliver the 2020 Hayek Memorial Lecture on the theme of the world after the pandemic, Dr. Stephen Davies.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for all the kind comments. I am very honoured to have been asked by the IEA to give the Hayek Lecture. I've been to quite a few Hayek lectures in the past, but I never actually dared to think that I would be invited to give one myself, even if under rather strange circumstances. So here we are, and the title I have is COVID-19 and Complexity, Hayekian Economics and the World After the Pandemic. The apocryphal Chinese curse of being condemned to live in interesting times has seldom been more apposite. All around us, what we thought of as normality has been upset and disrupted by the most serious pandemic since 1918. For many, this has come as a massive shock, a complete bolt from the blue, although it should not have. This may be understandable as far as ordinary citizens are concerned, but far less so in the case of political and business leaders. Faced with this situation, all kinds of expectations have been upset. And this process continues and repeats itself as the pandemic unfolds. Faced with this massive confusion and disappointment of expectations, serious cognitive dissonance has taken hold of many, leading to an outbreak of motivated reasoning, denial of reality, and desperate straw clutching on a massive scale, with all of this transmitted and amplified by modern social media. Faced with this, the more apocalyptically minded will be tempted to recall the words of W.B. Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, which Yeats wrote at the height of the Great Spanish Flu pandemic, while his pregnant wife was recovering from the disease, having narrowly escaped death. The words, I'm sure, are familiar to all of you. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Thinking of Yeats's words, certain questions come to mind. What is it that we face now, and what is it that we are experiencing? Can the centre hold, and if so, how? And as we look forward to the world the pandemic will leave in its wake, what kind of rough beast will be born? Is there any way of making sense of questions like this, and what kinds of answers may we find? It's very appropriate to discuss these matters at this time in a lecture named after and dedicated to F.A. Hayek. It is precisely his insights that help us to understand the nature of what we face, and therefore how difficult it is to deal with. Looking at the COVID-19 pandemic from a Hayekian perspective will lead us to be sceptical of assurance and certainty from several directions, and much more sure of our ignorance in many regards. At the same time, it will give us greater confidence in other ways. This is particularly true if we combine Hayek's insights with the evidence of history and the clues that that gives us. This led to the conclusion back in February that we should be very alarmed but not panic-stricken. Right now, it helps to make sense of where we are, even though the conclusions will be gloomy in some cases. And it leads to some notions of what kind of legacy the pandemic will leave. Viewing this pandemic through a Hayekian lens will head off both apocalyptic panic on the one hand and willful denial of reality and even elementary mathematics on the other. One thing it should lead us to realise is this. Much of the commentary about the pandemic and its effects has made the point that most of the chaos and disruption we are currently experiencing is not the direct result of the pandemic, but rather of the responses to it. So it's a secondary consequence of the pandemic rather than a primary one. Now, that is true, but it's also true that this is really a distinction without a difference. Now, why is that? Well, the point is that the responses to the pandemic, which have brought about effects like a major hit to GDP, includes not only government responses, such as lockdowns and mandated social distancing rules, but also the collective or aggregate outcome of the responses of individuals and private entities such as firms. In other words, what we can see going on is a spontaneous and unplanned response or reaction to a natural phenomenon, a process of the kind that Hayek frequently described and analysed. And this has effects as great as those of government action, if not more so, not least because many of these responses are likely to become permanent. Looking at this response, and also at the disease itself in a Hayekian way, makes something else very clear. That is that the alternative to the responses that have been made of both kinds is and was not minimal disruption with most things remaining normal. That is simply impossible. The actual alternative, had there been no deliberate political action and had people not changed the way they behaved, would have been even more massive disruption brought about by the spread of the disease. In reality, this would have led people to respond in all kinds of ways that would also have had massive effects. Deaths, huge disruption of everyday life and productive activity, and the consequent major hit to GDP were inevitable, no matter what was done or what happened. To deny this is like saying, when told a hurricane is approaching, that boarding up your windows will increase your costs. This is not to say that there are not better and worse ways of boarding up, both in terms of cost and effectiveness. And here again, the Hayekian approach is enlightening. So how to understand pandemics, including this one, in Hayekian terms? Now, Hayek had, I think, 4 great insights about the nature of human knowledge. The first was the nature of knowledge itself and the problems and challenges that this posed for acting human beings. The insight was that the great majority of what human beings know collectively is dispersed, localized, contingent and particular, and tacit, incapable of being captured in words or numbers. And this poses very severe knowledge problems for all human beings. Secondly, he has the great insight into the nature of complex phenomena as opposed to simple and linear ones, with complex phenomena and processes being much more difficult, if not impossible, to capture or understand through abstract models. Thirdly, there's the way that these two things mean that the increasingly dominant approach in the social sciences and public policy, and even many of the natural sciences, is misguided and not helpful. And finally, there's the way that both natural phenomena and human society can be best understood in the light of these knowledge problems and the nature of complexity through the notion of spontaneous order as opposed to designed order. All of this can be seen very clearly if we look at epidemics in general, widespread and geographically dispersed epidemics more specifically, and the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. We can also see all this in the ways that both governments and the wider civil society of individuals and private associations or networks have reacted to the appearance and spread of the pandemic. Hayekian insights about knowledge problems and spontaneous order also, when combined with clear thinking about risk and probability, help us to evaluate both the actions of governments and the arguments made on all sides of what is an increasingly heated debate. One conclusion we will arrive at is that both of the main sides in that debate are wrong, inasmuch as they are both claiming an unwarranted degree of certainty and accuracy. Another is that we should think again about the whole idea of evidence-based public policy as opposed to evidence-assessed public policy. Now, epidemics are a well-known and much-studied part of medicine and biology. Some diseases are endemic. There's always a certain number of cases around at any given time, and usually this number is constant. Sometimes, however, the numbers of people with an illness will start to increase rapidly in a given place. Even more alarmingly, you can have the sudden appearance and rapid spread of an illness that was previously unknown in that location or even unknown anywhere. Now, such illnesses sometimes vanish as suddenly as they appear. More often, though, they persist and become endemic, although there may be repeated subsequent epidemic outbreaks. Now, what makes an epidemic, by definition, is that you have a situation where each case of an illness gives rise to more than one new case within a short timescale. This is the famous R number, or R0. This means that absent a check or limit, the number of infections will keep on doubling. The time it takes for the doubling to happen varies and depends upon a number of things. Notably, it depends on the size of the R number. So an epidemic is an outbreak of an infectious illness where the R0 is greater than 1.0. The more above 1.0 that it is, the more rapid the doubling will be and the shorter the time for the doubling. However, there are natural limits to this process of the doubling of cases. It never goes on indefinitely forever. What happens is that after a while, the pathogen runs out of new cases, new hosts to infect within a reasonable time frame. And this means that the R number falls below 1. This means in turn that after rising for a while, the spread of the illness stalls, and then the number of cases goes into decline as rapidly as it originally rose. And eventually you end up back where you started. Now, when you express this in graph form, it gives the classic epidemic pattern of an inverted V. However, an epidemic of this kind is complicated and difficult to model and measure while it's going on, but you can do it. Now, the reason is that while complicated, it is still a simple phenomenon as opposed to a complex one. There is a relatively straightforward transmission mechanism and pattern that you can model. The functions that describe the rate of growth of the number of cases and the geographical and spatial distribution of the infections are straightforwardly linear, and they yield near constant growth rates and geographical spread rates. You can use standard calculus to estimate the acceleration and deceleration of the spread and diffusion. It's a physically demanding task to collect the data points, but the law of large numbers means that as more and more are collected, the values will tend to converge on a mean figure, so you can arrive at much firmer estimates of variables such as the infection fatality rate, or IFR, the case fatality rate, or CFR, the R number, and the actual nature of the geographical and social spread over time. And this in turn makes it increasingly easy to work out where you are on the curve, the inverted V, how long it will be before you reach the peak and pass it, and how long it will be before you reach the end. And all this makes understanding what is going on and responding to it effectively much easier if you can manage to collect the data and if you can manage to respond effectively. However, this kind of simple and tractable epidemic is actually a special case. It only applies when the epidemic is sufficiently geographically confined and localized. If an epidemic spreads over a sufficiently large geographical area, Or, as often happens, in addition to that, it is transmitted in such a way that it leaps over large intermediate areas rather than spreading in a geographically continuous fashion, then it ceases to be a simple phenomenon. It becomes instead a complex one. There will be multifarious feedback loops and a varied and constantly shifting dynamic. It becomes much more like the climate, for example. The degree of randomness in the whole process increases dramatically. By analogy, this is like the difference between a single fire, however big it may be, and a dispersed and scattered forest or bushfire, where it is difficult to impossible to know where the next fire will start or how fast and in what direction it will spread. Now, this is where Hayek comes in, as the distinction between simple and complex systems and processes was one of his major insights. This distinction and its application to how we should think about the pandemic and our response to it was set out in Professor Mark Pennington's IEA paper, The Response to the Pandemic, a Hayekian View. Something that all of you, I think, should read. All of this means that a geographically dispersed pandemic, particularly one that does not have a spatially continuous spread, cannot be modelled in the way that a simple one can. You can, of course, construct a model, but it will only be able to come up with very general predictions. While it is going on, the accumulated data as to cases and the like will indeed make some things increasingly clear, such as the IFR, for example. But it will not generate firm or reliable measures of the dynamic processes, such as that of the spread and diffusion, that you can rely on or use to make accurate forecasts. This is true even if the methodology of a range of probability envelopes is used. It's not possible to come up, in other words, with anything other than very general predictions. What you can and must try to do is to work out how likely extreme outcomes are, and therefore what the downside risks of various courses of actions are. In other words, you want to be able to estimate the exponent of the curve, the thickness or fatness of the tails of the probability distribution of various kinds of outcome. In all of this, history becomes very important for the following reason. Information, as opposed to noise, is something that you come to have after the event rather than while it's going on, much less in advance. As the pandemic is going on, you get a flood of data coming in, but a lot of this doesn't make sense at the time that you have it, because it doesn't form a pattern that you can readily or easily understand or fit into a model. The big problem, therefore, is that data or meaningful information only really becomes available in hindsight, after the events have happened. It's actually impossible to get while things are going on and happening. This means that the evidence of previous pandemics is a useful heuristic, even if that is always qualified by the reality that things never happen in exactly the same way twice, and the more general problem of the fallacy of induction. Historical evidence, though, is certainly more useful than predictions derived from models that treat large-scale and immensely complex phenomena, such as a pandemic, as though they were small-scale, singular, and simple. Now, understanding that the COVID-19 pandemic is a complex phenomenon in the Hayekian sense should lead us to several interesting conclusions. In the first place, we should cut governments a lot more slack. They are having to make very demanding decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty and without the option of waiting until things become clearer. That's because if you do that and something really bad starts to happen, which is quite likely, then it will be too late to do anything. So you are always in the position of having to make decisions with radically imperfect information, which means you have to err on the side of caution. Moreover, because the data coming in is not meaningful as it is arriving and only becomes really meaningful with the passage of time, Governments, metaphorically, are like somebody driving a car at very high speed in reverse, but with no rear view mirror or with their back windscreen blacked out. You have a pretty reasonable idea of where you were, but only indirect evidence as to where you're going on the basis of where you've been before. Secondly, though, we should not be that forgiving, because it's clear that some governments have done much better than others by straightforward metrics, such as the death rate of those infected or the rate of spread of the infection throughout the population. One clear conclusion that we can already draw is that of the importance of simple competence and administrative capacity. Governments that have followed the same strategy have often had very different outcomes, and this is due, for the most part, to straightforward administrative competence or the lack of it. Thirdly, the difficulty of knowing things in advance or even at the time means that decisions have to be taken right at the start, a point I've already made. And what this means is that the key calculation is not the most likely outcome as calculated using a model that assumes a normal distribution curve and generates a range of best case and worst case outcomes, but rather knowing exactly how likely an extreme outcome is and what the likely downside cost of an extreme outcome is. Now, elaborate predictions about the future that assign apparently definite probabilities to specific outcomes are not going to work. At the same time, the arguments of so-called skeptics that all of this is nonsense and we can assume otherwise certain outcomes if we do nothing or something less drastic is also wrong. The current debate is presented as being an argument between model-driven advocates of lockdown on the one hand and skeptics on the other. Now, it's true that the predictions of those who are making the case for lockdown have an unwarranted degree of certainty to them because they're based upon models that, for the Hayekian reasons I've gone into, do not have the reliability that many people think they do. On the other hand, their opponents, the people who are arguing against lockdowns, should not be described as skeptics because they also have an unwarranted confidence in what will happen if their preferred course of action is followed. In other words, both sides of the current debate are flouting the Hayekian insight. They are both assuming that we have much more certain and definite knowledge of what is going on and, more importantly, what is going to happen than we actually have or can possibly have. Now, what about the history of pandemics and what this tells us? Well, pandemics have been a recurring feature of human history, and they have played a major part in shaping it. In the modern world, which means since about 1770, they've become much more frequent than they were in earlier periods of human history. The best estimate, depending on how you define a pandemic, is that we've had somewhere between 20 and 24 since 1815. Now, what this means is that we now have a lot of historical data for both viral and bacterial pandemics. It is a viral pandemic they're dealing with here, of course, now, and in fact we have not had a serious bacterial pandemic since the early part of the 20th century, the 1920s and 1930s basically. That is not to say, though, that we might not have one in the future. Now, back in March, I gave a webinar that surveyed all this historical data, and on the basis of that, I made various predictions. The predictions I made then and elsewhere at the time have proved to be pretty accurate. Now, why was this? Not because of any great insight on my part, but for a very simple reason. Historical data, unlike the data coming in as the pandemic is unfolding, actually conveys information. It also reveals patterns and structures that we can reasonably assume will be repeated and will occur again in the current pandemic. One of these is about this pattern of the spread of the pandemic over time. Pandemics typically start in a very specific part of the world. They then spread out from that original source point along long-distance trade and travel routes. These may be to do with trade, they may be to do with pilgrimages, they may be to do with tourism. What this means is that initially the disease of the pandemic spreads to large connected urban hubs, leaping over other territory in between. And you then get an initial phase in which there are a number of geographically unconnected outbreaks in large, globally connected cities. What then happens is that a much more complex process begins in which the spread and diffusion backfills all the spaces that the pandemic had leapt over in its first phase. This is the pattern we can see in pandemic after pandemic throughout the course of not just the last 200 years, but the whole of the last 2000. Another is that a viral pandemic always has at least 2 peaks of infection. Now, these are often described as waves, but actually the metaphor of a wave is not helpful here. It makes more sense to think of these as being aggregate peaks of the numbers of cases that the pathogen gives rise to over the history of the whole spread of it. Another third one is that historically viral pandemics typically last for 18 to 30 months as far as the bulk of the world is concerned. So we should not expect to have a pandemic which on a global basis will be suppressed in a much shorter time than that. If we do that, then we've really hit the jackpot and been extremely lucky. Finally, there's also the conclusion that you will be driven to by looking at any number of cases that without any response, if there is no response, the downside risk will be very severe and highly costly. Now, those are all things that you could deduce from the historical evidence of previous pandemics. 2 things have become clear about COVID as the pandemic has worked its way through the world. One of these was already clear by March. The other became clear by early to mid-May. The one that became clear by May was that this pathogen, the COVID-19 virus, has an extraordinary variation by age in terms of the severity of the illness that it causes. For people under the age of 25, it's not a particularly dangerous illness in most cases. But as the age goes up, it becomes more and more dangerous, and there's a marked jump at the age of around 60. So for the over 60s, the over 70s, and particularly the over 80s, it is a really, really dangerous illness with an IFR comparable to that of famous diseases such as cholera. The other thing which became clear right at the start, as early as March, with the evidence from places like Lombardy and elsewhere, is that the virus has a powerful capacity to crash hospital systems. The reason for that is this. Although about 80% of all infections with COVID-19 are asymptomatic and therefore do not produce a visible or serious illness, in a significant number of cases, smaller but still a large enough raw actual number, it causes a very serious illness. An illness that will require, in many cases, significant medical intervention, including, in the most severe ones, hospitalization. The real killer is that hospitalization is not only going to occur in a reasonable sized proportion of the total number, but it lasts for a long time. You typically have to remain in hospital and often in intensive care for at least 2 weeks and probably longer. Now, what that means is, given the nature of the hospital system we have, that the COVID-19 virus has an almost unique capacity to crash our intensive care unit systems by simply flooding them and overloading them with cases that have to be treated. And this then has enormous knock-on effects for public health in general, as well as for the fatality rate that the virus itself has. Now, what all this means is that given the severity of the impact of the virus and the relatively high probability of a very bad outcome, the correct course of action, if you can do it, is this. First of all, you have to react very, very quickly as soon as you have the first signs that the pandemic has started and long before it has become an obvious problem. The obvious analogy here is with the one that Nassim Nicholas Taleb has given. If you're on an aeroplane and the pilot gets on, smelling of drink and staggering, you do not think, oh, I'm going to wait and see how he handles the plane, and if he makes a mistake. What you do is get off the plane while it is still on the ground. And that's exactly the kind of situation we face with COVID. Moreover, if you see someone playing Russian roulette and the hammer falls on an empty chamber, you do not congratulate them on good judgment. You conclude rather that they are a moron who has had a stroke of good fortune. What you have to do then is this. You have to close your border to foreign travel and stop as much long-distance travel within your jurisdiction as possible. You impose strict controls on large gatherings, super spreader events. You have an effective test, trace and isolate system to identify the initial cases and stop them starting a cascade of cases. In this case, the key thing is to have all parts of the test, trace, isolate working. Having the test and trace working but not enforcing the isolation is simply useless. It's going to have no effect. Now, if you can do all of this and you do it soon enough, you may be able, as the East Asian countries have been, to cut off the spread right at the start. In that case, you will then be able to relax controls and go back to something like normal life, apart typically from having to maintain very tight controls on foreign travel in a relatively short period of time. Now, this sounds like a prescription for dramatic and large-scale government action, but actually that's the wrong way of thinking about it. What you actually are looking at here is very decisive and strong, but limited government action. Limited because it's done soon enough that you don't need to do anything more extensive, and limited also in time. The bulk of the heavy lifting is actually done by civil society and spontaneous order processes. The problem, though, is this. It may be that by the time you realise that there is a problem, it's already too late. The metaphorical plane has already taken off. And that means that you will not be able to do the kind of things I've mentioned and have them cure the problem. In that case, you have to fall back on other measures. And it's at this point that Hayekian knowledge problems can become acute, and if you're unlucky, insurmountable. The essential thing is to have as effective a system of TTI as possible. Without that, nothing will work. It doesn't matter what policy you have. If you don't have an effective test, trace, isolate system, the policy is not going to be as effective as it would otherwise be. So if you have an effective TTI system, then you can rely upon measures like general mask wearing, strict social distancing, controls on things like large indoor events to control the spread. If you don't, these will have some effect, but probably not enough. What is not available is an option that will avoid massive disruption or allow the majority of the population to live as normal. To think that there is such an option once you've gone past the point of being able to follow the measures I set out a few minutes ago is a fantasy. So the idea that you can get around this problem by isolating and protecting the vulnerable, the immunocompromised and the elderly basically, and leaving everybody else to live a normal life is a total fantasy. In order to actually be able to protect the vulnerable, you will have to impose such controls and restrictions upon the rest of the population that they will not be living normally, and you will be in exactly the same place as you were if you went for more general controls. In addition, the historical precedent that the pandemic will last for at least a year, probably 18 months, means that this is not practical anyway, because you can't effectively put a large part of your population, about 20% in most Western societies, into effective house arrest for that kind of duration. It simply isn't possible. Now, it's worth saying also that even if you do have an effective TTI system, as for example the German Federal Republic does, if the numbers you are confronted by rise above a certain point, then it becomes simply impossible to deal with it. Because the sheer number of cases that you have to deal with and follow up will overwhelm even the most efficient system. And also, Hayekian knowledge problems will simply become insurmountable. And at that point, the blunt instruments are the only ones that you have left, as they're also the only ones that you have left if you haven't got an effective TTI system in place to start with. Now, the blunt instruments are, of course, the historically normal ones of quarantines and curfews, or lockdowns in the current vernacular. These are a sign of failure. Having to do this shows that all of the other options are exhausted. Nobody wants to do this. The problem is that it may be there is no realistic alternative because the other alternatives have been exhausted, and bearing in mind that the alternative of doing nothing is not available. Now, at this point, many economists will start to talk about trade-offs and cost-benefit analysis. At one level, this is sensible and reasonable. However, the idea that there's a trade-off between the economy and measures to control the spread of the virus is simply false. The unexamined assumption behind that argument is that if you do not impose the costs of lockdown, or lesser measures such as strict social distancing, then those costs will not exist, but other costs will not take their place. And that is simply not true. And the Hayekian insight is what helps us to understand why. In this case, it is spontaneous order theory that explains things. If the pandemic is spreading rapidly and visibly, with rising numbers of hospitalizations and consequent deaths, then people and firms will respond on an individual basis. Collectively, these individual responses will bring about an ordered and patterned state of affairs at the level of society as a whole, which will have almost exactly the same economic effect as a lockdown or very strict social distancing rules. One medical argument is that the lockdown will, if we're driven to it, cost as many lives as it saves because of diversion of medical capacity and other people going untreated. Now, this would be a potent argument for a disease with different features, but it unfortunately doesn't work with COVID-19 because of the distinctive one feature that I described, its capacity and ability to crash hospital systems. A general or wide spread of the illness will not only cause large numbers of deaths, particularly among the elderly, it will also crash the hospital intensive care system, and that will inevitably mean lots of other deaths from cases going untreated because the facilities will simply not be available because they'll all be taken up with COVID patients. And we're about to see this very grim scenario playing out, I fear, in some parts of the United States. Now, we're now in a position to see some of the things that the experience of the pandemic has told us. I'm going to be modest and just run through 10 very quickly. First of all, there are the benefits and costs of a globalized and interconnected world economy, a great society, as Hayek called it. Now, this undoubtedly brings increased vulnerability. There's a reason why we've had so many more pandemics since the appearance of modernity as compared to before. The reason, of course, is the much higher level of travel. People and goods are simply moving around the world much more than they used to. But this is outweighed by the enormous benefits that this kind of great society brings. It means that we have the knowledge and resources to deal with pandemics far more effectively than our ancestors did. Plus, it also means, as we have seen, that the society is more adaptable. Supply chains and things of that sort, which many thought would be in severe trouble or under severe stress a few months ago, have proved themselves to be far more adaptable, resilient and flexible than was feared. And this is actually a function of the increased integration. Secondly, we can see the enormous benefits of innovation, something that Hayek emphasized a great deal in his work. The great poster child here is, of course, the way in which, in record time, 3 vaccines have been produced and passed their tests. The Oxford vaccine is particularly important because this involves a major breakthrough in vaccine technology, which has enormous and far-reaching implications, not just for COVID, but for all viral illnesses. And what this shows is the enormous value of an economy and society that is open, dynamic, and innovative. It shows how much better these can cope with unexpected challenges. On the other hand, What we can also see as a third conclusion is that the way modern intensive livestock farming works is a major disaster waiting to happen. This is a point that I made back in my podcast back in March. We have to find another way of producing meat and stop factory farming. If we do not do this, it will kill us, literally, sooner or later. Modern intensive factory farming could have been designed as a way of producing novel pathogens and making it easier for those novel pathogens to transmit to human beings. This is an incredibly high-risk activity. Sooner or later, it's going to throw up a pathogen with a really high fatality rate and a really high infectiousness level. And at that point, we really will be in trouble. So we need to stop doing this now. Fourthly, we live in an economy where many processes are over-optimized. They are basically too efficient in a way. There simply isn't enough redundancy. This makes them highly productive, but it also makes them very, very vulnerable, and it makes them highly brittle. The fifth conclusion is that the classic case of this, an example of this, is the contemporary hospital system in many wealthy countries. If you look at European hospital systems, with the notable and significant exception of Germany, they have much lower ratios of beds per head of population than they did 40 or 50 years ago. And those beds are used at very, very high rates. The rate of occupancy is typically extremely high, well over 70%, often over 90%. Now, this is very efficient, but it means that the system has enormous problems with coping with any kind of sudden surge in cases. They can barely cope with regular flu seasons. When you have something like COVID, they simply can't manage. And so the hospital system in many parts of the world, interestingly not in East Asia, has features that we really need to think about redesigning. What we can also see more generally, and this is the sixth conclusion, is that there's been a decline in the emphasis on public health as a central feature of the health system, and a shift of emphasis instead to therapeutic medicine. Now, this is exacerbated by the way that public health has been redefined in many wealthy Western countries since the 1970s, something commented on the work of Virginia Berridge, for example. Public health used to mean provision by the state of resources that prevented people becoming ill and helped them to maintain health. Instead, there's now a focus upon personal behaviour and lifestyle, which is basically irrelevant when it comes to dealing with a pandemic and a massive waste of resources. We need to think very seriously about reorienting our systems towards more focus on public health and less perhaps on therapeutic medicine. Seventh, one I have already highlighted or flagged up. It is competence that matters in government. All of the evidence from this pandemic is that competence is more important than the size of government. Governments that are small have done well, governments that are large have done well. It appears that there's no correlation between the size of government and its competence or effectiveness. This is also true of ideology. Governments of very different ideologies have performed equally well or equally badly. And rather alarmingly, it doesn't even appear to make a real difference what policy you follow, as long as you follow it effectively. So competence is what matters really, more than size, ideological orientation, or even precise policy. Eighth, everybody on all sides of this argument is putting too much trust in abstract models and reasoning. We need to put more trust in historical evidence and less on that. Ninth, we need to think as a society about systemic risk in a different way. We have been almost certainly seriously underestimating the systemic risk of a major pandemic. We need to adjust that kind of calculation. And 10th, evidence-based policy is nonsense. You should openly and honestly decide what to do on the basis of normative principles or ideology, if you will. However, there are two things to add to that. Firstly, this is not an excuse for idiocy. It should be combined with a reasonable idea of what the chances and costs of things going wrong are. Secondly, this does not mean that evidence does not matter. What it means is that evidence will only really become available after you've done something for a while, and at that point you evaluate it. Sometimes if the risk is high enough, you have to make decisions on a precautionary basis even before the evidence is available. But in other words, you should have evidence-evaluated policy rather than evidence-driven policy in cases where the downside systemic risk is sufficiently low. And in particular, historical evidence matters. Now, what can we say about the likely future world? Well, as I've said in several places for the IEA, what this pandemic, like others before it, has done is to accelerate and magnify things that were already happening. It has shone a searchlight on a flock of white swans and made us more aware of them. I can see 4 things that would have happened anyway and were starting to happen anyway, which the pandemic has accelerated. First of all, a major debt crisis that will have to be resolved one way or another. Debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid, and there is a large amount of unrepayable debt out there. Public debt is a problem, but not the really big one, because governments have abilities and powers to deal with debt that private households and firms do not. The real problem is private debt, and particularly corporate debt. A huge amount of the debt that is out there is going to have to be renegotiated, extended, rolled over, or simply written off. Until this is done, the whole financial system is going to be extremely fragile. Secondly, there will be sectoral shifts in the economy. The obvious one, which I think everyone's aware of, is the final passing of traditional brick and mortar retail in many cases. Maybe also the passing of the office as a main form of employment, or work, I should say. Now, what this means more deeply, though, is a major blow to what has come to be known as the FIRE sector of the economy: finance, insurance, and real estate. Real estate in particular, and particularly real estate in major globally connected metropolitan areas, is going to take a major hit in the short to medium term. And this is going to have significant effects upon the importance of that sector relative to other parts of the economy. Somebody has speculated recently that we may have seen peak London, but not perhaps peak Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, and the like. The same is true elsewhere. We have probably seen peak Paris, peak New York, peak Tokyo. Thirdly, something I've already alluded to, there are going to be changes in work and living patterns. Many people have discovered that they quite like working from home. They are not keen on going back to hour-plus commutes or the stress of working long hours in the centre of a large metropolitan area. Firms, for their part, have discovered that in fact having localised working and only occasional visits to the office is actually highly effective. And so I think we're going to see a sudden huge acceleration in a change in the way in which work is organised and structured, both geographically and in terms of time. And finally, I think there is likely to be significant reshoring of production and shortening of supply chains as people evaluate risks differently. This again is something that was already happening, but will be given a big boost by the pandemic. Now, going forward, we should think of this as a close shave or a warning shot. If you are playing Russian roulette and the gun actually goes off, but because your hand jerks, the bullet doesn't go through your head but only gives you a flesh wound on your scalp, you do not then think, gosh, that's not as bad as I thought it would be. If not at all, you realise you've had an incredibly close escape and you resolve, if you've any sense, not to do it again. There are 2 points I already made back in March with regard to this. Firstly, this pandemic could have been much, much worse. In many ways, we actually have got off lightly. And secondly, this is going to happen again, and sooner than many people think or thought before it happened. It was thought that pandemics like this were a 100-year event, but actually that's not true. They're at least a 20-year event and maybe even as little as a 10-year event, which would mean that in each individual year, there's a 1 in 10 chance of a pandemic like the one we currently experience. And certainly we can say that for various reasons, major pandemics are becoming much more likely. Their probability is rising quite clearly. And this means two things that will have big effects. Firstly, human beings in general will change their collective behaviour in a spontaneous way because their sense of risk and perception of risk will shift. And secondly, I think we will see permanent shifts in policy. And what we will see almost certainly is the reintroduction of old but tried and effective methods of preventing the spread of large regional pandemics, and therefore they're becoming truly global pandemics. The major one, I think, will be the reintroduction of short 4 to 5 day quarantines for long distance travellers. This was at one time the normal state of affairs, and I think it will be reintroduced with obviously far-reaching effects. Now, it's easy to think that we're living in a period of chaos and that the people in charge do not know what they are doing. But thinking about where we are from a Hayekian perspective tells us that these two things are actually untrue. There is actually a pattern and order to the way the pandemic works and to the way people respond to it. But this only becomes fully apparent in retrospect. Secondly, governments are faced with very severe knowledge problems. The problem they have is that neither they nor their critics will acknowledge this. Both sides, as I said, are asserting unwarranted certainty and confidence as to what they can do and what they can know about the future. In addition, the tools that governments have are in many cases not the ones they need. The Hayekian approach suggests the need for a sensible precautionary principle going forward, and also along with that it suggests the need for strong but limited government action as the way to deal with pandemics. This time some parts of the world, specifically the East Asians and New Zealand, have done that. The rest of us has not. It remains to be seen if we will learn that Hayekian lesson and respond better to future pandemics. Thank you.
Well, Steve, thank you very much indeed for such a fascinating and insightful and on occasions rather terrifying lecture. You've raised some extremely interesting issues, not least that you think that pandemics could be, well, not quite the norm, but a much more common feature of society in future, 1 every 10 years, you suggest. And I'm sure people will want to be asking you questions about that. Just a reminder now, if you're watching us on the Zoom side of the call, please put your questions in the Q&A box and indeed vote up the questions that you want. If you're watching us on the YouTube side of the broadcast, I will seek to try and pick out some of the questions there, but I'm going to abuse my power as the chairman of this event by asking Steve a couple of questions first. I really liked, Steve, your view that you need to sort of act very fast at the start is crucial, and you should err on the side of caution. You actually gave, I guess, unusually from an IEA person, a sort of a bit of a round of applause for the precautionary principle. But I wonder if I could test this a bit more. I'm trying to work out how a judgment could be made. I loved your idea of the aeroplane's about to take off. You know that I can't really say the pilot might be drunk or something. You get off now. But if you're erring on the side of caution, how would you know that you weren't merely erring on the side of caution, that you were being cravenly cautious? Yeah. I mean, for example, if you sat on an aeroplane and said, one of the air stewardesses looks a little bit nervous, perhaps that's because she knows the pilot is drunk or ill, and perhaps that's enough evidence for me to get off the plane. You can't be too careful. This would be the sort of world in which, if government policy was seen through that lens, you would be getting off every single plane, because there would be some piece of evidence that led you to decisive action at the start that might save your life eventually, but more often would actually mean you just could never take a flight because you'd act decisively with a modicum of evidence or insight at the start. Could you say a little about how you err on the side of caution without being cravenly cautious?
Yes, that's the key question. In an absolute sense, a precautionary principle where you don't do anything if there is any associated risk is a recipe for, sitting at home in a bunker and not going outdoors, because actually the chances that you'll be killed if you walk out in the street are actually significantly higher than the chances of you being killed in a plane crash, for example. So the key calculation you have to make is, what is the likelihood of an extreme event happening? And if the extreme event does happen, what are the downside costs of that? If you want to put it in mathematical terms, you want to know how fat are the tails of the distribution of possible outcomes. And so in the case of a plane, if you see a drunken pilot, then you think the probability that something bad is going to happen is pretty high. And you know that if that does, let's say you think it's 1 in 20, and you know that if that 1 in 20 chance does come up, you're dead. So in that case, it makes perfect sense to get off the plane. On the other hand, if you think that there's an indication that something might happen with a likelihood of, say, 1 in 10,000, it doesn't make sense to get off the plane. So the key calculation, if you can make it, is what is the likelihood of a seriously consequential bad thing happening? Now, to give a specific example, you and I will both remember when the unfortunate Stephen Dorrell MP, as he then was, had to announce in the House of Commons that suddenly they'd realized that BSE could spread to human beings. And we don't know, it might kill nobody, it might kill, 1 million people, but don't panic. Now, at that point, if you applied the ridiculous form of the precautionary principle, you never eat meat again, and all kinds of things. However, at the time, I was not alarmed, and most people shouldn't be alarmed, because it became obvious, given the mode of transmission of the prion, the thing that caused BSE, that anybody who'd eaten a meat pie or a sausage in the previous 2 decades was at risk, which meant basically the entire British population other than the vegans and vegetarians. And so basically it was a case of, nobody's developed the new variant CJD Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease yet. Therefore, really, realistically, the chances that you're going to get it are very, very low. So this is not an area where the worst outcome, widespread infection with the prion, is likely, given what we know about it. So that's a case where you can reasonably say the chances of a bad outcome are sufficiently low that you don't do it. So that's the key calculation. So it's not just a general blanket precautionary principle, it's a modified precautionary principle. And it's modified by making serious efforts to work out what the probability, if you can, of course, what the probability of a really bad outcome is.
And just to follow up on that a bit before I come to, there's a whole stream of questions, so I don't want to hog you all to myself, Steve. But have we shown both actually at an individual level, not just at a public policy level, an absolute inability to make those sort of judgments and to assess risk? I mean, for example, based on one opinion poll, it's only one opinion poll. I mean, it's a bit sketchy, but I think that the average guess of a member of the British public about how many people in Britain had died from COVID-19 was 7% of the population had apparently been killed by COVID-19. I mean, this now that's, if you like, knowledge, but even on assessing risk, you could argue, could you not, with COVID, that, to use the pilot analogy, that, potentially it will kill everybody, but actually the hazard here is quite low. It looks like it's probably only affecting the elderly. The equivalent of me being not really trusting the pilot here might be there's a bumpy landing, but it's actually extremely unlikely to kill 5 million British people or 500,000 British people. But we don't seem to be able to process those sort of judgments. We seem to automatically, the evidence would suggest, err on the side of overstating both the chances of something bad happening and indeed the hazard associated with it.
I actually think that what happens is that people overstate the risk, but then their behavior shows that they actually maybe don't take that seriously. Now, what I think the reason for that apparently contradictory posture is that basically it's the lack of mathematical knowledge of the British public. And in particular, the fact that most people are hopeless at working out probabilities. So my actual, answer is that if you want the population at large on an individual and therefore aggregated basis to assess risk accurately, you need people to gamble more. Because there's nothing like gambling for teaching you about how probabilities work. And that's basically the problem that we have here. Now, yes, it's true. You want ideally to allow everybody to make an individual judgment as to what they think the risks are for them and to act on that basis. And that will produce a kind of collective outcome which will reflect society's general perception. The problem with doing that with an infectious disease, of course, is that if you have some people who are particularly reckless, they may actually they will have significant external effects on other people because they will infect other people and make the disease spread more rapidly and more widely than it otherwise would be the case. And so I think this is one of those hard cases where the general libertarian principle, which I support, of leaving people to be the best judge of their own interest and act individually, probably needs to be curtailed because the downside risks of doing that are too great.
Okay, I'm going to take some questions from the Zoom side of the chat. I've also got my eyes on the YouTube chat, so if you'd like to put a question there on the YouTube side, that would be great. The most upvoted questions, I'm not being biased towards those with associations with the IEA, comes from Professor Philip Booth of St Mary's University and formerly our editorial director here. He says, I agree that we should cut governments a bit of slack. Should we cut scientists a lot less slack? Even the epidemiological processes seem not to be susceptible to scientific modelling for the reasons you mentioned. Furthermore, scientists seem incapable of considering trade-offs, even at the simple level of allowing for deaths caused by economic damage arising from shutdowns, never mind trading death rates off against something else. The response of scientists always seems to be tougher to stop the spread of the illness to save lives, as if there is nothing else that should go into the decision-making process. Could you comment on that, Steve?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly what is going through the minds of all of the scientists, but 2 points to make there in response to what Philip asks. The first is that, yes, I think there is something wrong, and this is the point Hayek was making way back in the 1940s, about the way a lot of contemporary social, biological, life science actually works, in the sense that I think there's an exaggerated confidence in the ability to use modern technology, large, powerful number crunching computers and the like, to generate what people then think is firm understanding of predictions of complex processes, when in fact, as the study of all kinds of things like ecology, climatology, even cosmology shows us, this is actually a mug's game. The whole universe is vastly more complicated than you can capture in things like that. You're constantly finding out that you're correct in reverse, but not going forward. So that's a fundamental methodological problem. I think basically a lot of academics, not just scientists, are being seduced by the apparent gift of super powerful computing facilities. Now, in the other respect about trade-offs, I don't know what is actually going on there. It may well be that scientists, epidemiologists, medical scientists and others are resistant to the idea that you can make trade-offs where people's lives are concerned, even though the reality is that we do this all the time. So that may just be what you might call the doctor's ideology, which is that the saving of life is something which has higher value than absolutely anything else, which I doubt even many doctors believe that in their actual personal conduct. On the other hand, I do suspect that a lot of this kind of rhetoric is actually adopted for reasons of public persuasion. In other words, it's being used because the scientists have concluded on probably good grounds that you need to take some pretty drastic action, but they want to persuade the public to support it, and they think that the way to do that is to either scare them or to make arguments about how it must be worth doing it because it will save lives. So I'm not clear in my own mind as to how far this reflects a genuine belief or ethical attitude on the part of many scientists, or as opposed to the degree to which it's actually a form of rhetoric that's designed to produce a particular effect in terms of influencing public opinion and public behavior.
That's fascinating, actually. Let me just follow up on it. You're suggesting that perhaps we should start seeing that the pronouncements that we hear from scientists need to be looked through the lens of behavioral economics or nudge. You know, you're suggesting, perhaps, you're speculating, you're not asserting this, that they sort of fear if they only give you the bare facts, you won't listen. And therefore you sort of need to dial it up a bit, sex it up a bit in order to get people to sort of conform. You need to be sort of slightly more hysterical. I mean, not necessarily completely altering the data, but it's a form of it's a sort of policy that would be conducted by the nudge unit, isn't it? If that's the case.
Yes, I think there is an answer to that, and I think to some. I mean, I've made it sound really rather Machiavellian and cynical in a way. But obviously, in most people here will sincerely think that it's the right thing to do, that it's for a good end. But also, I think that this is a function of the activity you're engaged in, because if you're a scientist who is engaged as a public figure, as Chris Whitty and the others are now, in influencing or explaining why a particular public policy should be followed, then you're inevitably engaged in advocacy. And advocacy is a different kind of activity with a different vocabulary and different rhetoric to simple reporting on what you have found and what your hypothesis is. And so scientists, if you actually read their papers, are constantly qualifying what they say. They're extremely averse to coming out with bold, direct statements for good reasons. They know perfectly well that the way the science works is that you constantly test things and qualify your assumptions. But if you're in advocacy, you're in a different ballgame.
Very interesting. Let me take another question here from Christopher Marshall on the Zoom chat. He picks up on one part of your lecture, in which you pointed out that, of course, there would be a sort of grassroots, automatic, spontaneous order response to a pandemic happening, even if you had a government that was absolutely hell-bent on doing nothing. You might actually get a sort of spontaneous order lockdown. But Christopher Marshall asks, I think you suggested that if the government hadn't ordered a lockdown, then most people would have just stayed at home anyway. But I don't believe that happened in previous pandemics, such as the Spanish flu and the more recent Hong Kong flu.
Well, two things about that. First of all, it did happen with the Spanish flu. If you read historical accounts of what happened in 1918, and particularly 1919, during the really deadly second wave of that pandemic, lots of people did change their way they behaved. People did stay at home a lot. And also many places imposed curfews and what we would now call lockdowns, particularly in the United States, where quite a number of cities imposed really strict curfews and lockdowns on their entire population. So you also had massive popular response, not surprisingly, because people were literally dying like flies in some places. It was a terrible illness. So that's not true. Now, in the Hong Kong flu pandemic, which I remember because I'm old enough to actually remember it at the time, there was general concern, but yes, in that case, people didn't react so much. Now, I think the reason is because it was nowhere near as lethal as the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19, and also because, as I can speak from first-hand experience, my mother was a nurse at a hospital in South Wales, a place called Tonner at the time. It didn't put the kind of pressure on the hospital system that COVID has done now. Now, given the nature of COVID, I think that the kind of things it would have led to would have indeed caused, maybe not panic, but certainly extreme public alarm. And I think you can see evidence of this. Speaking of purely anecdotal basis, I noticed that in the 2 weeks before the lockdown was imposed, the trains to and from London had only a fraction of their normal number of passengers. And actually, that's not just anecdotal data on my part. It's also borne out by figures like passenger numbers and the like. So I think the evidence is that there was a big response. Sweden is the other final case in point, because in the case of Sweden, the government there notoriously, has not imposed a lockdown, but the hit to GDP brought about by the changes in the behavior of the Swedish population largely has been pretty much in line with that of most European countries of a comparable size.
Interesting. I'm going to take two questions from the YouTube chat from the same person asking two questions which are connected a little. These are on your view, Steve, that there were changes that were already in process, but if you like, an event like this puts the foot to the floor on the accelerator. So things that might have been happening anyway will speed up. Richard Puddlecoat asks, I found in my business that productivity has soared due to having to work from home. Could an unexpected benefit be a widespread increase in productivity in many sectors? And goes on to say, also, what will be the effect on public transport? Now there will be a permanently reduced demand. How should it now be funded? He doesn't say this, but obviously given it's already heavily subsidized, or does it become a historical relic? So sort of those are two of your points about how this might accelerate a process in employment and working that was already underway, but this is sort of supercharging it.
Yeah, very, very good points. About the one about public transport. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have this huge network of commuter railways around London in particular, which may well never get back to anything like the capacity that they were being used at before the pandemic happened. If there's a really large-scale permanent change in working patterns, as I expect there will be, it becomes a relic, I think. You'll probably keep it going, but I imagine there's room for considerable savings because, as you say, even with the kind of ridiculous fares that people pay in the Southeast, they're still incredibly heavily subsidized. Now, about the thing, I think, yes, there will be a big increase in productivity. This is one of the benefits. Just think about the amount of time people will not spend commuting. I mean, commuting is almost the quintessential wasted time. I mean, I know you can listen to podcasts and music and this kind of thing, but really, it's not a productive use of anybody's time. Man is born free and is everywhere in trains, as somebody once said. And that's all time that is now freed up for more productive use. And I don't know what business your questioner is in, but I think a lot of firms have discovered that their staff are actually more productive. And their great fear was that if they weren't in the office, they wouldn't be doing work, they'd be goofing off. But what that ignored was the reality that actually there's a lot of empirical evidence to this effect. The maximum amount of time that people can actually work at peak productivity in a daytime is about 4 to 5 hours tops. Most of the rest of the time in your office, you're doing stuff like messing about on Facebook, checking your personal emails, and annoying and irritating your colleagues by chatting to them and trying to live out the life of the office in real life. So you're not actually doing anything productive. So actually being at home, even if you are only working for 4 or 5 hours, you're actually probably going to produce a lot more than if you were in the office with all that goes with it. What it does appear to be necessary for human contract reasons as much as anything else is that you see your colleagues pretty regularly. So I think what we're going to move to is a situation where people are in the office maybe 1 day a week, or maybe they work 3 weeks at home and then 3 or 4 days in the office. So there's still the human contact. But that means if you're a company that you probably only need about a quarter or a half of the office space that you had before.
This is fascinating. So I'm going to ask you just to speculate a bit further. This has just come to mind for myself that, if to generalize, the absolute norm was sort of whatever line of business you were in, you would generally turn up to the office between 9 and 5, Monday to Friday. And now, in fact, it will become more, if you like, culturally acceptable that you're doing your work from home. I mean, a good example would be members of the IEA research team, right? I mean, if the IEA is paying you to write a research paper, doesn't much matter whether you're sitting at a desk here at the Institute of Economic Affairs in Westminster or if you're doing it from home and you save the commuting time. But do you think this might actually start changing the careers that people choose to go into? If you're a kind of extrovert person, somebody, I see Jonathan Castro has said in the YouTube chat, I don't like working from home. So if you're the sort of person who doesn't want to just sort of get out of bed, say, hurrah, I've saved my commute, I can now just go and sit in my office and type away. I want to go and socialize actually with 15 or 20 people involved in a joint project. And perhaps I want to irritate them a bit and tell them corny jokes and send them Facebook memes. Might people start choosing different career paths based on whether whether they want that experience in their working life or whether they can do without it or indeed would rather do without it? Whereas, until now, it's been, to all intents and purposes, a universal feature of being in the workforce.
Absolutely. It could be changed a lot. I mean, obviously, we're talking about office work here, much less true for other kinds of work. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be true for care work. It's not going to be true for manufacturing, for example. But yes, it probably will change the way people do. I mean, at the moment, this is wonderful news if you're an introvert. But if you're an extrovert, you're probably feeling pretty miserable and cooped in, So I think you're quite right. It will lead to quite big changes in work patterns. The other thing it will lead to, I suspect, is a major change in geographical location. Because right now, there is this very strong feeling that if you're born in, say, Manchester or Leeds, certainly someone like, say, Sunderland or Newcastle, you've got to get on the train and go down to London if you're going to make anything yourself. It's like Dick Whittington, basically. That will no longer be so true. You'll be able to do stuff and not leave where you come from. And I think that's going to have a big effect. Now, You mentioned I work for IHS. That organization has been going down that road for quite some time now. They have lots and lots of staff scattered all over the United States who basically work remotely. And that's been a practice they've moved into for the last 5 or 6 years, and they found it works very well. And I think that in that case, you don't have to go and live in DC in its horrible climate. I think that kind of thing is going to apply here. That's why we may well have had peak London, as Paul Collier, who is the person I mentioned, has suggested.
Felix Hathaway asks, again on the YouTube side of it, this is quite interesting, goes back to the question I was asking you about early and decisive action. You know, it's sort of, if you don't act with a limited amount of information, but it can all be too late. Felix asks, can we ensure that we do not miss the window for effective early action in the future? How? I understood that the UK was thought to have a pretty effective system, sort of early warning system before COVID-19.
Yes, indeed. In fact, what is rather embarrassing about this is that the WHO regularly assesses different countries' preparedness for a pandemic. That's one of its jobs, basically. And the two countries that came number 1 and number 2 in its most recent assessment before this pandemic were the United States and Great Britain. Now, that's a bit like predictions for who's going to win the Premier League, where the teams that are tipped to come first and second are struggling in the relegation zone or bottom half of mid-table. I mean, I'd say Belgium is the one that's in the relegation zone quite clearly. And it's interesting. It shows you, I think, that the WHO's assessments were either inaccurate or based on the wrong criteria. And I think that it's a mixture of the two, actually. They put too much emphasis on basically certain kinds of things like having formal plans in place, and they didn't pay enough attention, it would seem, to the systems that were in place, and in particular the way the hospital system was structured. And also, I think basically everyone was taken by surprise by the form the pandemic took. It didn't help that the Chinese government basically obfuscated and covered up early on, but even allowing for that, I think Western governments were caught by surprise this time, and next time, as Felix suggested, it's very important that they actually have an early response system in place, that they're prepared to deal with it. What I think nobody really expected was the way that the COVID-19 virus would actually have such a disastrous effect on intensive care hospital systems. We were very well prepared for a flu pandemic, but the problem is flu doesn't have the same effect on the hospital system that COVID does, and that was where we were caught out, I think.
That's fascinating, but do you think you can even measure preparedness? I mean, as you're saying, that it was all sort of, have you got a system to do this? Do you have a plan filed in a drawer marked plans? Is it actually that sort of what you need is a propensity to decisive and flexible decision making amongst the political elite? And that is kind of, again, you only find out whether you had that in retrospect, right? I don't know how you sort of compare the Belgian Prime Minister to the British Prime Minister to the French President beforehand.
That's very true. I mean, one of the things this has definitely shown is that a lot of European governments are simply not very effective. Some are highly effective. Denmark's done really well. Norway has done really well. Finland has done well. But quite a lot of others, Belgium most notably, but also France, ourselves, the Italians, the Spanish, not covered themselves in glory. And it appears that it's a case of having a system which is oriented around following rules and procedures, no matter what, as opposed to taking decisive action is not the way to go. It's like the old military maxim that it's better to do something decisive quickly rather than think about doing something and because by the time you've worked out what's right, it's too late, the enemy has overrun you. So a standard thing in military doctrine is always, do something straight away, then work out later on if you've got it right.
Interesting. David Brand asks, David, you've put it in the chat, not in the Q&A, but I've managed to pick it up. I'm multitasking quite well at the moment. This goes back to a bit towards the middle of your lecture, Steve. He asked, can you expand on what you mean by therapeutic measures, please? I'd like to hear more of your thoughts here. This was your suggestion that we sort of moved away from public health to therapeutic measures. David asked if you could expand a bit more on what you meant by that.
Yeah, therapeutic medicine means basically treating sick people. So it means things like, using drugs to cure illness. It means surgical procedures, things that radiation and chemotherapy treatments for cancer and that sort of thing. So therapeutic medicine is the whole range of stuff that you do in hospital, or typically. One of the features of the way we do it in the modern world is it's typically done through hospitals, which increasingly I think is not the way to do it, but that's another story. So that's what I mean by that, basically. Now, that is opposed to, on the one hand, things like preventative or public health medicine, which is things like vaccination programs, providing clean drinking water, providing facilities for exercise, providing drains and sanitation, which is public health facilities, kind of infrastructural provision. And it also is different from what you might call personal health maintenance, which is, dealing with minor infections and treating yourself, making sure you keep fit, looking after your eyesight and your teeth, basically. So therapeutic medicine basically means treatment-based medicine of one kind or another, done in hospitals. I noticed also that he'd asked about what the
what's the fallacy of induction, David?
The fallacy of induction is believing that because A has always led to B in the past, it's always going to lead to B in the future. So the famous way of illustrating this is with a turkey. So you have a turkey, and every day the farmer comes in and feeds the turkey. And the turkey concludes from this that the farmer has its best interests at heart and likes it, and that it's going to keep on doing this. And then, did I mention this is American turkey? One day in November, something happens that you can't predict from past experience, which is not very good for the turkey. So that's the fallacy of induction. It's thinking that just because A has always led to B in the past, it's going to keep on leading to B in the future. Logically, that's not necessarily, well, it isn't true. That is not logically, doesn't logically follow.
Steve, we've still got a whole plethora of questions. I know we're on the clock. I'm going to try and just squeeze another couple in, if I may. I'm not showing preference to IEA staff. I am going with the ones that have been the most heavily upvoted. Angela Harbour asks, you say we should give governments a bit of slack, but should we give China or the World Health Organization slack? Or should they take some or much of the blame, perhaps as a result of their respective structures and cultures?
They should definitely take a lot of the blame. You can give the Chinese government credit for rather ruthless and brutal but effective dealing with the pandemic, but extremely low marks for the fact that they let it get out of control in the first place, and then mainly because people in the local level in Hubei province were too terrified to actually report what was going on higher up the chain of command. And then when they had realized there was a problem, to basically conceal it and lie to the rest of the world. So they banned most internal flights, but still allowed flights in and out of China. This is outrageous, quite frankly. So yes, we should take a very dim view of the way they behaved. And the WHO, I think, has in some ways done quite well in terms of its information gathering, but in other ways it's been seriously compromised. And this raises the big question about multinational international organizations. It's been seriously compromised by its clear political dependence upon certain countries, notably China. But there's also been a tug of war going on between the Trump administration and the Chinese government. And the WHO has been in the unfortunate position of being in the middle of this political competition between two big beasts, basically. So yeah, those two definitely should be given a bit of a mark down, I think.
Okay, I said I wasn't favouring people with associations with the IEA, but Philip Booth gets a second bite at the cherry because of the way democracy works. Your votes, guys, not my discretion. Philip says, asks, I'm interested in your observation about factory farming.
Yeah.
Factory farming was not implicated in the current crisis, and indeed it has contributed to improving nutrition with huge benefits, possibly even including in the current crisis. What is clearly implicated is the kind of markets with live animals that used to be very common in Western countries before factory farming. Factory farming, of course, has certain risks, but it has made animals more distant from humans.
I'm afraid that's simply not true. First of all, we know that the COVID-19 virus originated in bats, but we don't know yet how it got into bats. One of the problems with bats is they have incredibly active autoimmune systems, and so viruses that get into bats tend to evolve at a fantastic rate. So it's true about this particular pandemic, but several other major infectious disease outbreaks like SARS and MERS, for example, were caused by pathogens making the jump from factory farm poultry or pigs to human beings. And the way in which factory farming is conducted is, as I say, almost like an ideal environment for producing novel pathogens, because you have lots and lots of animals crowded together in very dense conditions, often fed heavily with antibiotics in order to control infection, which tends to produce broad spectrum resistance to antibiotics in bacteria. Now, that's an incredibly high risk activity. The real nightmare would be if we had a bacterial pandemic caused by a bacterium that was totally resistant to antibiotics, some mutant staphylococcus, for example. That would be an absolute catastrophe. Now, it's true that what factory farming has done is enormously reduce the cost of food, and it's made meat much cheaper and more accessible, but it's coming at an increasingly high cost, leaving aside the whole question of animal welfare for the moment. And also, it's not true that it's really completely distanced the animals from human beings, because obviously there are slaughterhouse workers, there are the workers in the factory farms themselves who are very likely to get infected with novel pathogens as a result of this. And that's where they can then spread into the wider human population. Now, I think what we should be looking at is developing new technologies. In particular, I'm a big fan of the technology of cultured meat, of synthetic meat, which is actually meat, but grown from cells. Now, that used to be a few years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, the very first hamburger made with cultured meat was eaten here in London. And that cost, I remember rightly, something like about $30,000 for a hamburger. That now the cost, the usual miracles of the market, the cost has been reduced to the level where Singapore has just allowed synthetic chicken nuggets to go on sale at a comparable cost to stuff got from battery farm chickens. And these were just chicken tissue grown from a single cell taken from the wing of a live chicken. And it got quite a lot of attention, happened a couple of weeks ago. And I think that that's the way to go. And that means that we now have the technology to move away from battery farmed chicken and intensively farmed livestock and have enormous benefits in a whole range of issues, quite apart from the health benefits.
This is fascinating. What's the public policy for that? I mean, do you think actually science will just come to our aid and these sort of synthetic chicken nuggets will become so cheap that why would you ever make nuggets out of a real chicken? Or is there some regulatory framework that you think we could impose, presumably globally, let's imagine we could just impose it everywhere, that would bring these risks to an end? Or do we just need to hold factory farms financially liable for any pathogen they release? Would that be enough to make them non-viable businesses? What's the public policy that would get us out? Or indeed is one needed? Is the market about to sort this out anyway?
I think basically the main thing is not to do something in terms of regulation that would obstruct the process that's going on. I think that the market and science between them are in fact in the process of very rapidly resolving this problem. So the thing to do is to make sure that you don't have a regulatory or licensing system that stops this innovation from happening. Now, I don't fear that there's going to be a kind of popular or media-led backlash like there was against genetically modified crops and organisms, partly because a lot of vegetarians and animal welfare people are very, very keen on synthetic meat for obvious reasons. It's like a huge win for them. And so I think that a lot of the impetus that there was behind opposition to Monsanto and GMO is not going to be there. What you could do, I suppose, is basically impose stricter controls and regulations on factory farms. For example, you could order them to reduce the use of antibiotics in animal feedstocks. There are good reasons for doing that, and that would certainly raise the costs considerably. So governments might try regulating the existing sector in order to try and speed up the transition. We would still probably have meat from animals, but it would almost certainly just be sort of pastured animals rather than intensive farmed animals. So they could do that. But I think the main thing is just don't get in the way and obstruct the process that's going on right now.
Okay. And I'm going to finish up with, well, I don't know if it's an easy question, but it's a kind of personal question, really. I don't know how you might want to draw some more wider principles from it. But Edgar Wilner asks, Steve, if you were over 80 years of age and you had children and grandchildren, would you spend your Christmas day with them?
Well, this is actually a personal question because I do have grandchildren. I think the answer is probably no, actually. right now, I think that the risk is too high. And in terms of that precautionary principle that I mentioned, I think I would take a pass on that. It is just what I know. You almost always think at that age, oh, this is the last time I'll have a Christmas with them. But on the other hand, I still think that the life expectancy being what it is now, that's still on the lower side. You should still take the cautious decision this time. That's what I would do.
Steve, we've run over our time, but thank you so much for giving this year's Hayek Memorial Lecture. Thanks to everybody who watched, asked some questions. Steve, thank you for answering the questions with your typical aplomb and insight. Many thanks to all of our donors. It's only you who make the IEA's work possible. And thanks to CQS for their ongoing support for this annual series of lectures. If you like what you've seen, please click over on our YouTube channel on the subscribe button and the notification bell and give this video the thumbs up. In the meantime, many thanks for watching what is the final event of the IEA this year before the Christmas break. But if you're craving more IEA content, that shouldn't be a problem. If you go to the IEA London YouTube channel, there are over 650 films right there on IEA London. So plenty of viewing for the festive period. We'll be back in 2021. But in the meantime, have a terrific Christmas and a happy and healthy new year. Thanks again, Steve, and many thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.